very happy to organize this conference together with WWF today. When we are aiming to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, when we're trying to reach zero emissions in the second half of the century, it is clear that we need short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning. We need that both at the European level and we need that at the national level. And these need to be in line with the goals that we have set in the Paris Agreement. And as was said by Andrea, it is indeed the aim of these plans, of these strategies, is to provide a vision. It is to provide a direction where we want to go in order for the policymakers, businesses, investors to know the direction and make choices that are in line with the goals that we have set for ourselves. As we're trying to keep the momentum alive on the Paris Agreement, we hope that the discussion here today will be contributing in that effort and show that Europe can and should be a leader in showing ambition also with its strategies. Whether we're talking about the integrated national energy and climate plans, NECPs, or we're talking about the national long-term strategies towards 2050, or even the review of the EU's own mid-century climate roadmap, it's clear that we should take both the development of these strategies as well as implementation seriously and ensure that these are coherent with the Paris climate objectives. So we are very pleased today, in the course of the conference today, to first of all start with understanding what is the state of play, what is the rationale and the way forward with national long-term strategies. Then we'll move on and we'll study closer some examples from member states to see what is being done and what could be some of the lessons learned also for others. And then we'll move on, and in our last session, we'll reflect on EU's long-term climate action policy within international context. So we very much look forward to a lively discussion today, and hopefully we'll all come out smarter and committed that this is the way to go and that we need a vision and that we need to do that together. We'll start off with the understanding and looking into the state of play with national long-term strategies. And I'll invite Imke Lupeke, Head of Unit for EU Climate and Energy Policy from WWF, European Policy Office, to present some of the findings and get us off to the day. Thank you. If I could just mention one practicality. In the course of the day, I'll be using my red and yellow cards to signal to all the speakers when it's 2 minutes to go and when it's time off, so that we can really stick to the time. So thank you.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you. I realize it's a pleasure to be able to present the results of this project after 2.5 years. And I have to say, I have the pleasure to present them, but obviously it's not my work only, it's teamwork. And that was a great and a really pleasant part of this project, and also deliverables you can find. So as said from both previous speakers, it's key, long-term strategies are crucial to deliver the commitments we have under the Paris Agreement. And as it stands right now, we know already we are not doing enough. We have to do more, we have to do it quicker. And long-term strategies, low carbon development strategies, actually, they provide an opportunity to define much better and clearer what we want to do, how we want to do it, who should do it, and by when we should do it. And it's this is a really solid backbone of a good planning. So moving to my next slide, which is already there. Sorry, back to the benefits, please. We heard already about what are the real benefits of long-term strategy. strategies. So we all know that we save money to avoid lock-in and getting to stranded investments. We know we ensure with having long-term plans that we do the right things short-term and mid-term. And that enables us basically to align our 2030 goals and the NDCs. So it's basically the goalpost where we want to be and make sure we take the right speed and the right measures to arrive there. So it drives innovation. It basically gives direction for business and stakeholders, and it drives new developments. It fosters innovation. And it also fosters stakeholder buy-in, many different constituencies interested and basically getting active to understand what is the long-term perspective. These are crucial benefits of thinking about the long-term strategies. So going back to what we have been doing and been aiming with this project, Maximizer, was already mentioned. That's a project which started in 2016. And yeah, our aims, we were aiming high in the sense of we were trying to contribute to, and this is part of our project description, finding ways to influence EU member states' long-term strategies. Because I think when we'd written this proposal, it was already clear this is basically in a bad status. So how we can help to make it better. Also, building capacity in institutions and in governments to talk about long-term strategies and to take this topic seriously, to improve the development and the implementation of that, to assess. And this is part of the project as well. How can the funding arrive where it should be? How can ETS revenues be used to help us to transition away from fossil fuels and to basically fuel the whole transition and the delivery of the long-term strategy? And last but not least, the goal of cutting emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. So when we started, what we have done first, the first thing, one of the first discussions we had in the project team was, okay, basically what is a good long-term strategy? There is no definition really of what makes a good plan, what makes a good strategy. We spent some time thinking about that, and you find in the next slide, you will find the definition, which is our definition. But I want to highlight some elements of that to you, which is that, and however it's called, in this case, we had low carbon development strategies because they are laid down in the monitoring mechanism regulation. But whatever name this takes, we think these are key elements. And this is basically a national greenhouse gas reduction plan in line with Paris Agreement goals, which also takes into consideration citizens' prosperity and well-being, and it has clear goals and a 2050 target, is based on best scientific understanding and on participation of stakeholders. We felt these are key elements, and we made it part of the assessment methodology, which we've developed with the help of Ecologic and our own network, spending time to think about how we would assess and how we would judge the quality of those strategies. So the elements of the definition are part of the assessment. If you take one thing, because I know it's not readable on slide, you all got this card, this A4 card. Please have a look if you want to read. This Greek temple is basically supposed to give you a sense of what we have been doing. So when we started, we felt that we need to have something which gives us kind of a benchmark of what qualifies as a low carbon development strategy. And you find at the bottom of this Greek temple the 4 elements basically which we felt are essential to qualify as a long-term low carbon development strategy. So which is a 2050 target, which are policies and measures, which is a good analytical basis of what is proposed, as well as stakeholder consultation. So based on this first kind of barrier hurdle, the low carbon development strategies had to pass, we basically assessed them with 48 indicators and 10 main criteria. These 10 main criteria you find in this Greek temple with the 3 pillars. We call them substance, credibility, and process, telling us how good is the substance of such a strategy, looking into the level of ambition, into whether all sectors are covered, asking how credible is that what a country puts out. We know when we started that this was basically an exercise which was done in some countries but ended up in a drawer of a ministry without having any impact or political commitment or translation into other ministries and policy actions. So that's a very crucial part for the credibility of those plans. And the last thing is about the process. It's about long-term strategies are about, it's not like a plan of one person or several people, it's a plan of which should be embedded in the wider society. That's why the process is quite crucial. And yeah, you find more details about those criteria there. This has formed the basis of how we looked into these low carbon development strategies. We have taken the material we have taken were those plans which had to be delivered under the monitoring mechanism to the European Environmental Agency, where they had to basically report the plans and any progress in the years after. And this was what was given us in this project to look at. We did the assessment twice. Once in 2015, because they had to be developed, submitted the first time in March 2015, a second time in March 2017 to assess progress and yeah, basically look into any other actions from other member states. This slide gives you an idea or basically is reflecting the result of our assessment. What you can see, the green bar is how the member states scored in 2015. The blue bar pillar is how they scored in 2017. I think the biggest missing piece here is part of the most important story. We have 28 member states. You see on this slide for 2015, 11 member states. For 2017, you see 13 member states, which means more than half of the member states haven't delivered a long-term strategy at all. Also, this has been European law since 2015 to do that, which just tells us a story about what was the political attention member states have been basically given the long-term strategies. So, and it's quite surprising. It's not a big improvement between 15 and 17. You can see, please, again, back to the other slide. Thanks. In 2017, so 11 countries in 2015, the average score was 52% based on our evaluation method, and I tell you more about the different elements of those strategies a bit later. But 2 other member states delivered between 15 and 17, which was Estonia and Czech Republic, and that's great. Other countries, they actually submitted new strategies like UK as one example and Germany, but also some other countries added documents which we've assessed and led to a higher score, as you can see here. Overall, our conclusion from that is the quality of those 13 strategies is highly variable, and it's overall a low quality because, as I said, the average of those strategies is just about 50% based on our methodology. Next slide, please. And I'm asking you again to be active and to take this, the other side, the backside of the sheet I've shared because it's too small to read here. So how well, basically this gives you a sense of how well have countries been doing towards the 10 criteria which we've defined in this project, which are actionable. How actionable is the strategy? How ambitious is the strategy? What is the analytical basis? All these criteria you find at the bottom. I want to mention a couple of results. Our report gives all details on those for each country. But you can see that UK, France, and Finland, for example, they scored very well on the analytical basis, thanks to accessible and thorough studies underlying the strategy. Also, Ireland scored very well on actionable because they have been very precise about details on policies, measures, even roles and responsibilities in the different ministries, which obviously gives a high credibility on who is taking up the task to deliver. As said, you find all the details in our report. I want to, next slide, please. So the ranking criteria, the 10 criteria, it's just an average about over these 13 countries on where they are better and where they score less good. So you can see public transparency, which we've defined as making the documents available and accessible, is they score very, very well. On ambition as well, there's more to say on that, which I will mention also during the discussion about the ambition and how the EU roadmap influences that. I think there is an important point to make. There is the analytical basis, which is also good. They are less good on monitoring, and there is a lack of political commitment as well on the fact to make it actionable. With all the details I've given in terms of why is Ireland's strategy good, because we know who is responsible for which part of the strategy. Next slide, please. Yeah, basically these are our recommendations and provide kind of the 10 tips we've found based on the work we've carried out, but also on a literature review which has been done in terms of what is available about any recommendations, any good planning on long term. And there is a report which sets out our recommendations based on the evaluation and this literature review. And you find these are the 10 points we find crucial to look at, to assess, and to start the development of such a plan. Next slide, please. Part of our project was, as I mentioned before, looking into revenues and the aspect of finance. We only took a kind of limited approach in terms of focusing on ETS, but obviously that's a huge funding stream, potential funding stream. So, and it was interesting to see that the climate spending kind of being in law asked to be 50% of the auctioning revenues from ETS. Between 2013 and 2015, there was 85% of the auctioning revenues from ETS were spent on climate. 95% of that was on domestic climate and only 5% on the international. So we think ETS revenues are an important stream to feed the transition. That's clear. So how can that be improved? And I think that's not a surprise, it's nothing new, but full auctioning is really important, making polluters pay for what we want to have in different, making them pay for the change. That's the idea. Removing surplus allowances from the market and ensuring that countries spend 100% on climate action, domestic as well as international. Yeah, next slide, please. One element of our project is to reach out and to get in touch with stakeholders and to see how stakeholders understood long-term planning and to understand what their contribution is, what their view is, what they need from long-term plans. We did that in several webinars, but we also brought together supporters from for long-term planning development. And strong 2050 climate strategies. You see this mix of organizations from business investors to civil society, and I think they are calling for a continuous work on those long-term strategies and for a dialogue on how that can help for the transition and for their own decisions they have to make. This is an ongoing and live community we've created. We see others take up those communities and take up elements of discussions that need to happen. But we will also continue to be in touch and find out where we can be helpful to make this transition and the discussion about that happening. One of our key venues at the moment is, and where we see really a big opportunity, is the governance regulation and the ongoing trialogue discussions, one this afternoon. And we think it's a big opportunity basically to bring the knowledge and the understanding we've gained through in the last 2 years into this regulation by qualifying the Article 14, giving guidance to member states, because one of our clear messages here is without guidance, there's a lack of seriousness of working on long-term strategies. There is a lack of comparability and a very wide range of quality. And I think we have to improve that if we really want to get there where we want to be, which is to secure that we limit our temperature increase to 1.5. So we think more needs to be done, and that's the immediate venue for us to land with those recommendations, and I guess we have a chance to discuss this further. I stop here with sharing results, and I encourage you to visit the website or to get in touch with us to get more details about what we have been doing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Imke. If I can ask the panel to join me here, and we'll start the discussion going. As our next speaker, we have, yes, please, do take a seat. As our next speaker, we have Henry Weissman, Coordinator for Decarbonization Pathways Network, ITRI. And it would be very interesting to hear your take on the rationale, as well as what really should happen in Europe if we are to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the Maximizer team for inviting me to share some insights of what we've done so far. We'll take a perspective that's quite complementary to what's just been presenting, speaking to, I mean, how can we concretely design some long-term pathway that can both be relevant to different country contexts, but also be consistent with the global goal. And here we're facing a challenge of articulation. And I will do that by sharing some key lessons learned from a project we've been running at IDRI, so the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations in Paris, which is called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which was notably a project where we've worked with 16 country teams, essentially big players, G20 players so far, including the four main emitters in Europe, and to try to work with them on the concrete design of these long-term pathways. And even if this is an international project, I think there are some lessons we can learn from this process that can be useful for the European process as it's framed now, notably to try to understand how we could improve the scores that Imke just presented in the next round of revisions, but also to try to learn some lessons on how this national plans that are currently being developed by the countries can also be connected to the work that's done on the 2050 roadmap that is currently developed also by at the European level. So I will just share 4 main lessons. I will go quickly through that and just not entering obviously into any details for the results. You can find everything we've done on our website, which is deepdecarbonization.org. But I will just provide some distillation of these main lessons. The first lesson is the value of what we call backcasting. By opposition to forecasting, where we would ask the question, what can we do, what is feasible? What we need to do in the context of the Paris Agreement is actually to do the other way around, to start from where we need to go, which is very clearly set in the Paris Agreement. Collectively, we need to be at net zero emission as soon as possible in the second half of the century, and understand what does it take to go there. So what are the concrete measures that need to be taken today? Long-term strategies is really not informing what happens in the long term. It's what happens in the short term to make the long-term transformation possible. And this requires some very concretely work at a very granular and detailed sectoral level, because what we need to understand notably, and that's been also mentioned by Imke, is that the sectors will evolve differently. They are facing different challenges, notably the question of lock-ins. When we are talking about infrastructure, there are some decisions that need to be taken today if we do not want to face massive lock-in that would prevent us from going to the ambition we want to reach in the end. The second lesson is the value of an approach that's grounded on the national specificities. And here, I mean, that's clear also that all the countries are very different. They are facing different circumstances, different potentials, different challenges. And when we are doing that, the main objective is to start from the realities of the countries, notably to ensure, and again, that's been very clearly set in the definition of the long-term strategies, which is ensure well-being and prosperity. I think that's a broad objective, but that has very concrete dimensions. We need to take into account prominently the socio-economic priorities of the countries and the specificities. And again, this has some concrete consequences on how do we design these strategies in a way to make that possible, and notably the value of national scale analysis, data analysis, and modeling is key if we want to be able to capture as much as possible the interplay between all these dimensions, the socio-economic aspects and the decarbonization ones. The third lesson, and that's, I think, very important also to mention here, obviously all countries are different, but still there are some knowledge that can be shared, and there is a big value in sharing knowledge across countries, given their differences, but also because there are some commonalities. And that's the experience we faced in the DDPP, where we were working with 16 countries, very different, emerging countries, industrialized countries. But what we've seen is that a way to trigger ambition in the progressive revision of strategies is also to facilitate this knowledge sharing, because it's a way also to raise awareness on some solutions that maybe in the first place you don't imagine, or you don't know. But by looking at what the others say, it's not a matter to say that you need to apply directly what others do, but by looking at what the others do, you can also learn what can be relevant for your own context. And this has some concrete implications in terms of sharing, defining a common set of indicators. I'm not saying sharing all the details of the strategy because it's not relevant, but sharing some concrete set of indicators that could be compared from one country to the other, and that could facilitate this knowledge sharing process, again, for the benefit of the countries themselves, not for external people necessarily to monitor what people are doing, but really for the countries themselves to look into their own transformations. The fourth and last lesson is this challenge of articulation and the value of making a collective vision emerge from these country specificities. And I think that this is both the beauty, but also the challenge of the Paris Agreement and the process as it's been said consistently in Europe, is that obviously we start from the country realities, but the question is, okay, what are the lessons we can derive collectively? And here, the lessons we've learned, again, by doing that and implementing that in our project, is that by working on the country by country basis, but also in a way that can make emerge a collective lessons, we can identify notably the opportunities and requirements in terms of international cooperation. And that's obviously true at the European level. What are the European policies, what are the European measures that should be taken in order to support what the countries need in order to be able to apply the long-term strategies. And here again, these are some implications in terms of how these strategies are reported in a way to make this assessment of the collective visions that need to happen in order to facilitate the collective learning and the national transformation. I will stop there, mindful of time, just mentioning that it's a great pleasure for me to announce you that these principles on the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project will be applied on the European context. We'll launch a European version of this project next month in Paris, with country teams coming from 15 to 20 countries, so trying to be as inclusive as possible and potentially try to expand to other countries. And the idea being to try to provide some research-based evidence that could support then the discussion both within the countries, but also the connection between the countries and the European level. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Henry. It's superb to see the work ongoing, so there's a lot to be built on as we move forward. Just to say, unfortunately, Claude Turmes, MEP, was not able to join the discussion today, but we're delighted the institutions are still represented. And we have, as our next speaker, Paula Pino, Head of Unit for Energy Policy Coordination from DG Energy, from the European Commission. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you. It's okay to stand, yes, of course.
Thank you, good morning. And thank you to EPC and WWF indeed to organize this event on a very topical subject. I can understand that MEP Turmes cannot be here. Will be probably joining him in only less than 2 hours for, as Imke mentioned, the next trilogue of the governance discussions. So it is indeed a busy day to discuss notably also what we have here as a topic today. Now, I've been asked to look into the question of how can different parts of the energy sector work together most effectively to drive the clean energy transition. So we're looking at it a bit now from the energy angle. And when we have in mind that 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions today come either from the production or the consumption of energy, we do have an interest indeed in looking at what can we do in the energy sector to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And it's been a long work and a long path from the 2020 targets and now looking into 2030, where, you know, there was a mandate from the Council to look into at least a 27% share of renewables in the overall EU energy consumption in 2030, at least 27% of energy efficiency, and 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Now, this was a bit the framework on which the Commission was asked to deliver and implement it, notably through legislative proposals. But ever since, there was this energy union strategy, which put forward 5 different dimensions. The first one being decarbonization, which does include the renewables. So first pillar of this energy union strategy, decarbonization. Second, energy security, energy internal market, research, innovation, and competitiveness. So we are looking into 5 interlinked dimensions, and all of it to deliver on the overall energy union objectives, which is at the end of the day to ensure an affordable, sustainable energy system overall. And then comes Paris in 2016, which adds to it and adds to the ambition and steers the way and puts it in a global context and sets a clear signal that the clean energy transition and the transition as a whole is here to stay at the global level. And so what are we willing to do to deliver on this ambition? The way the Commission is contributing to it, we put forward the so-called clean energy for all Europeans package of legislation, which covered from renewables to energy efficiency to the modernization of the electricity market design, and last but not least, if I may say, the governance proposal, the proposal for a regulation on governance. And we do expect to deliver on our contribution to these overall objectives through this package. Now, here comes the difficult part. Part of this, the question I'm asked today is, how can we work together? And this is indeed the difficult part. And this is exactly what the governance proposal is looking into. Not to individually what is energy efficiency delivering towards decarbonization, what is renewables to do, but how can we do it together? And this also against a very innovative background. Other than for 2020, where we had foreseen an EU target, which is translated into national binding targets, for 2030, the Council came up with this idea, there will be an EU target for renewables, but it's not translated into binding national targets. So now Commission tell us how we will be able to deliver on that. And that's the purpose of the governance regulation, to really see, okay, how will we make this work? How can we make sure that member states, on the basis of what are national voluntary contributions on energy efficiency, on renewables, deliver on what is an EU binding target? This is one of the objectives of the governance, but it's not the only one. As I said, it's working together. And it's not just looking into all the 5 dimensions of the energy union, it's also going beyond and saying it's not just energy, it's about climate and bringing in, integrating the climate policy. So we're dealing here with the first ever legislative act, which is not only cross-sectoral within energy, but which also integrates the climate policy and says, how can we together deliver on this clean transition and long-term decarbonization objective? And we're proposing to do it on the basis of integrated energy and climate plans, which are comparable across all the member states in the EU, which will cover the 5 dimensions, which will identify what each member state is willing to contribute to each sectoral objective, what are the policies and measures that it will put in place, and very importantly, how are the synergies between all of this? What is the impact of my energy efficiency policies on renewables, on energy security, on competitiveness, and indeed overall on decarbonization? This is something that had not been done so far. And if you look at member states, and we've seen the long-term strategies already, which are scattered. Now here, we didn't even have a framework for member states to work on. So if you look into the member states' reality, you will see different plans with different time horizons, with different coverage, and certainly not comparable. And here, what we are proposing is a template covering the 5 dimensions, where it will be able to compare the ambition and really look into synergies. Now, this is for the short and midterm, 10-year plans. But the governance also includes the long-term strategies, picking from Paris Agreement and the commitment that we've engaged on when we were invited to communicate by 2020 mid-century long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. No matter how you call them, and we do get lost in the various names that this has got, what I want you to retain is, yes, the governance regulation is also looking to the long term. The long-term strategies are foreseen. The Commission in its proposal had said there needs to be consistency between the plans and the long-term strategies. Now, we did have a bit of a challenge here because we need the draft plans in a way earlier than the long-term strategy. So how can we ensure consistency? And this is now being tackled with an interesting proposal, only 2 months old, from the European Council, who 2 months ago, in March, asked the Commission to prepare for the first quarter of 2019, a long-term strategy on the reduction of greenhouse gases. And this is what the Commission is now doing. We are preparing already to work on this long-term strategy. So this is complementary to what we are proposing in the governance regulation, which is for member states to come up with their own long-term strategies, along with their national 10-year plans. Now the Commission is being asked to come up with its long-term strategy, which of course should reflect what our member states' intention. And we will come up with this still this year as a basis for the future discussion. This strategy should reflect on the vision for a competitive and post-carbon European economy in the long term. It should look into ensuring a socially fair transition across the economic sectors, have really a holistic look at the economy, at the various sectors, at transport, at agriculture, see how it all comes together, seize the benefits of the sectorial integration, look into the potential of various technologies that are emerging, and really examine what are cost-efficient scenarios towards decarbonization by 2050. So this will require, of course, also massive investments, which we are well aware. On this long-term strategy, and I need to finish, there will be a public consultation soon, so you will all be invited to contribute to it. And in the meantime, we'll continue our negotiations on the proposal, notably of governance, where the long-term strategies, the excellent work which has been done by Maximizer, and which is really a good basis for us to look into, and to also already recognize the challenges for member states to come up with such a strategy, for an assessment to take place. And now we'll have to go through the same exercise with integrated plans, which will also come along with these national long-term strategies. And this is how we together, and I put the emphasis on together, trying to really break the silos, are wanting and intending to deliver on the long-term vision of decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It will be a very complex exercise putting this all together, but we're delighted obviously to be here and contribute to the thinking, because clearly much needs to happen in a very short period of time, and that there's a lot of demand also on member states to deliver on that. Yes, I'm sure that there will be a number of questions when we move on to the Q&A part, but before that, as our last speaker, we have Kirsten Dunlop, Chief Executive Officer from Climate Kick. Innovation and knowledge sharing, we heard that already, plays an important role. So we look forward to hearing what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Kirsten Dunlop, Climate Kick. And the questions, to be specific, that I was given to reflect on is reflecting on the importance of long-term strategies, of climate strategies, in creating an environment conducive to innovation and knowledge. So that would be very much building on the introduction that you put. Why is that so? What matters there? And what kind of innovation do we, for example, consider to be key in delivering the Paris targets? So let me first just give a little bit of an explanation of where I'm speaking from. Climate Kick is a member of the EIT community. So that means we are a knowledge innovation community, that's the Kick, funded by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. 7 years old, we're one of the first three that were created. And what that practically means is that we are a public-private partnership of organizations from all over Europe and beyond the borders of Europe, working together as actors in a community of climate innovation action. And those partners are big industry, small businesses, individual entrepreneurs, alumni, city governments, regulators, not-for-profits, universities. So it's a very, very big and broad mix. And the system that if you like, it's a multi-sided platform. It's a place, a space in which we bring innovation actors together, provide funding, catalyze and support exchanges, the formation of consortia, action along a number of lines of intervention. Many of them are whole systems, so we're addressing the whole systems around urban transitions, food, forestry, land use, agriculture, the production and consumption of core materials, cement, steel, plastics, bioeconomy, and the drivers of some of those changes that we know we need, the financial system, risk metrics, decision metrics, education, and the policy. So it's a big broad brush, which means that where I'm speaking from is the accumulated learning of 7 years of taking European Commission funding through the Horizon 2020 program and making it available through a set of derogations to private world actors seeking to bring forward a relationship, a set of exchanges across research, knowledge, education, entrepreneurship, and industry transformation. And looking at what happens when you broadly connect that to a societal challenge like climate change. The two reflections that we've made at what is effectively for us a midterm assessment of impact and progress is that that kind of circumstance produces a rich supply of possibilities, particularly possibilities that tend to pattern into single point solutions with a very strong emphasis on technology and on the whole anchored in something familiar. They are on the whole incremental solutions. And that rich supply we can see is not taking the next step to combine and integrate and begin to act together as solutions that change at a level of systems. So those individual solutions are there, they're out in force, they're often solutions looking for needs, looking for capital, looking to find their way into the existing dynamics of the market. But what they're not necessarily doing are beginning to aggregate and transform themselves into integrated, interdependent interventions in the way in which we think. And that for me, if I look at that learning from 7 years, and I place that in the context of what we see and we hear and we know about the climate challenge. If you think about the report that's just come out on European emissions going up, regardless of notwithstanding all of our efforts, you think about the fact that effectively Europe would need to be in net negative emissions by just after 2030 for us to make 1.5 degrees. That is a radical change. And that brings me to this question of what is the relationship between long-term challenges and innovation and climate change? We are dealing with uncertainty and at the same time urgency, which means we have a particularly difficult challenge. We need to work on both structural change and behavioral change, two things that are incredibly difficult to do, for which we are particularly ill-equipped. We need to change social structures and norms built up over the last 300 years, and they are the hardest things to change in any kind of intentional way. The second problem is that the nature of the challenges we're addressing are inherently complex. In fact, it's the largest kind of complexity that we can possibly imagine. So almost all our instruments for planning simply are not useful. We can't manage and milestone our way through this change. We're going to have to learn how to deal with complex system change, learn and train ourselves how to harness systems dynamics, which is not something that we have really understood how to do or to design our economies to do. Long-term strategies have an advantage, which is that they are coherent. They're more coherent with comprehending and engaging with the scale and the non-linearity of the kinds of transitions we need to bring ourselves, our habits, our beliefs, and our assumptions to. They also enable us, and here I will absolutely reinforce this notion of backcasting. They enable us to address the problem of magic thinking, i.e. 2050 we need to be this, today we're still doing this. It'll sort itself out. Let's just keep setting some targets in 2050. It will not sort itself out. We are going to have to design a set of different choices, and that really requires us to challenge our imaginations, not our capacity to plan. And that brings me to for me, the most essential point, working in the heart of innovation. We need to change ourselves. This is about human conditions and humanity's ways of believing. That means we need to access and activate our rational brains, this part of our brain, not our limbic systems. So we need a strong and a steady narrative. If you look at human transitions over 3,000 years, we have mobilized ourselves to change through myth, through powerful narratives that have given us a strong and a steady line of sight that is big enough and spacious enough to hold a lot of diversity of positions and nonetheless give us space to create and experiment and to learn through experimentation. But holding that course means that we aren't permanently second guessing what the rules of the game, how the rules of the game are going to change when the next regime comes in, and retreating back to protect ourselves. So what concerns me about a focus on short-term outcomes, a focus on planning, is that we tend to short-circuit ourselves back into reactive thinking and narrow targets. But more importantly, short-term thinking and planning is nested in the idea that market forces will solve the problem for us if we can create enough new business ideas and enough money spinners in alternative energy and farming and building to release self-interest and attract capital and solve the problem. It's our abdication of choice and leadership in favor of market forces that is causing a significant part of this problem. So hence, for me, as an innovator facilitating innovation, the challenge here is about the scale and the scope of our design. And that brings us to the type of innovation we need, and therefore why there's such a dependency upon a long-term strategic space of action. The kind of innovation we need is the innovation that gives us the capacity to radically transform systems. If you think about what innovation is for, it's about making a difference in yourself that enables you or encourages you to do something different to your advantage. If you think about innovation in the context of business, strategic innovation is an ability to make a difference in your business self for your competitive advantage, but it operates at the level of structures and assumptions. Systems innovation is about making a difference in whole cells, whole industry cells, whole sets of economic norms and paradigms and assumptions, putting together multiple fragments of solutions and testing them as an integrated whole so that we can bring parts of the technology solutions, parts of the planning solutions, parts of the behavioral change, and begin to experiment with a whole system playing together in ways that we've never actually had to do before. For that, you need a space of visioning, and you need a space of consistency of action. Most importantly, you need something that allows us to formally structure learning through experimentation, the notion of innovation options that enables us to project ourselves forward into something we don't understand. So remembering as we play out the difference between strategies and planning. Strategies are a mechanism for dealing with uncertainty, which is what we're dealing with. Planning is our narrative for the ways in which we will fill the gaps. We are constantly needing to negotiate the difference between the two. Innovation and the exchange of knowledge helps us negotiate that difference, but not if we don't have a capacious enough space to create and explore.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you very much also for this clarification. I think it really helps us as well in differentiating between strategies and planning, as you put it. I hope this microphone, it's okay? Yeah. I would like to open the floor for questions. There has been a lot of interesting input from this first session already, and there are a number of microphones rolling. I would ask you to raise your hand and introduce yourself. Thank you. Yes, let's start here on the right.
Good morning, I am Florine Gonsolin from CEFIC, representing the chemical industry. Thank you very much for sharing all this interesting input, and also for informing us about Maximizer project. Looking at the different criteria that you have used to assess the long-term strategies, at first sight, I would say that they are rather relevant. One question I would have, also looking at the ranking of member states that you have now established, and I see, for example, that Cyprus is coming list on that list. I was wondering, have you looked at all in your assessment at the reason behind why the member states are not necessarily performing as well as you would like? Because if I look at Cyprus, we know this is a country with a lot of specificities. It's an island, it has quite a hot climate. So is it at all taken into account in your research?
Thank you. I would take another question. I saw a question at the back. Thank you.
Annika, thank you. Mark Johnston. A quick comment and two questions. For me, at least, Europe is a place where we solve common challenges together. Europe is a place where we solve common challenges together. So if I have one general critique of the project presented, it's that there's not enough emphasis on using the institutions to get there, and too much emphasis on singling out member states on an individual basis. That's the comment. First question, to the project representatives, Annika began her introduction with the 1.5 target. For the project representatives, what greenhouse gas target for Europe would get us there, in your opinion? And for example, do the project representatives agree with the target put forward by Kirsten in her presentation? Second question, more specifically, Paula, sorry, a common theme. 6 years ago, WWF and others asked the Commission to find a replacement for its models, its energy modeling, the corrupt primes model in particular. The good news is you accepted that request. The bad news is the alternative is still not ready yet. So the new long-term plan proceeds on the basis of a modeling ecosystem that is still intransparent and not open source. So how long do we have to wait further until we get to a modeling system that all of us can see inside? Thank you.
Let's take these questions first, Inge.
The questions. I start with a question on Cyprus. First of all, please, I encourage you to have a look at the details of each criteria in our reports. But the way the assessment has been set up is that we've taken the information which has been submitted to the European Environmental Agency, and that has been kind of the material we use to assess the quality of those strategies. It's part of the challenge Cyprus has to respond to with a long-term strategy to reflect the specificities of this country. So I think we've, in the way we found the strategy so far, it hasn't scored very well on many issues, but I think it's a process which needs kickoff and further elaboration, and we hope with this project and the reflection on these criteria that this will happen in Cyprus. Going to the next question, which is about in Europe we solve problems together. Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. Nevertheless, we are a multi-governance level kind of. We work on many different levels of governance. That's important. That's part of success, but also of challenges. I think this project has two key asks, which is I want to re-emphasize. The one is one key outcome of this project is that the level of ambition as well as the analytical basis carried out in Europe by the European Commission has informed most of the member states' level of ambition as well as the analytical basis. This is why Europe's mid-century strategy is so crucial, because we know already that the level of ambition that will be set out there will reflect in what we see as national long-term strategies. So that's key, and that's a key starting point or a key input to national debates, and then national governments are free to reflect and to take that into account. But I think it has a very important signal, political signal to governments, and also reflects discussions which are already ongoing between governments and the EU. I also want to mention on that point that we feel there is a lack of common action on long-term strategies, and that's a point I've made before. The governance regulation has done a very good job, we think, in terms of bringing together requirements on climate and energy, on reporting, monitoring, and that was a real success and a real way forward, integrating those things in the governance regulation. But still, the long-term strategies appear to be an afterthought and not qualified in the sense of it's almost similar to what is in the MMR. While the experience tells us we need more, it doesn't need to be, or the member states need guidance on how to produce them. And also, I think there is an open question here based on the previous interventions. How will the European Commission or European institutions facilitate and help to facilitate the exchange between member states and between different actors to help and to facilitate the learning which is needed? And I think these are chapters and points which should be addressed and added in the governance regulation and also the mid-century strategy.
Yes, thank you. Well, I will not comment on your assessment of the model which is currently being used. We are working on a new model which has been presented as a pilot already to member states. Now, in the governance proposal, which covers a very strong analytical basis. So when we're asking member states to come forward with their plans, we ask them to also underpin these plans with a very, very strong analytical basis and really look into the impacts of the objectives, the policies and measures that they're putting forward in terms of economy, in terms of environment, in terms of social aspects. And we are giving the possibility, of course, to member states to go for their own models. We're not imposing a model on any member state. And I confirm that indeed we're coming with a new model which will be ready notably but for the assessment of the plans by the time we will receive them from member states.
Yeah, two quick reactions on the comments made. On the one hand, the question of doing things together, I think that part of the assessment of the national plans is to figure out to what extent they can be useful to feed this discussion on what we need to do collectively. A good national plan is a plan also that can notably reveal what are the requirements in terms of the boundary conditions for countries, so what depends not on the country but also from the European regulations. And I think that this back and forth between the national scale and the Europe scale is very important, because if we take only a European perspective, then we will be missing the specificities of the country. So having national plans that can be better done, and by better done I mean also that better reveal what are the conditions that do not depend only on the country but also on other contexts, including the European policies, is one of the key criteria. And I think it's cross-cutting to some extent to many of the criteria that are used by Maximize. I will not enter into the detail and let Imke discuss that if you want. But many of the criteria that are used are actually a way to better inform this type of discussion. And very quickly on the modeling side, I will take my hat of a modeler, because I must confess that I've used some models, not primes, but some others. Just want to remind, I mean, the models are just one of the tools that I use. And so we know the usual sentence, which is that all models are wrong, some are useful. And I guess that the question is not really about the details of the model that's used, but how it's been used. And that's, again, all the discussion about how the work on the 2050 roadmap can be better connected with the work that will be done within the countries. And I mean, what we see that obviously it's a challenge, but there are lots of thinking that are going into this direction. And to some extent, the nature, the details of the model that will be used by to design this roadmap is less important than the way this model will be informed by the nature of the domestic transformation that are done in the different countries.
Thank you. Yes, we have a number of questions. Let's start. Helena, if you can go to Matthias. Behind you, sorry.
I'm Matthias Duver from Ecologic Institute. Congratulations to WWF for the excellent project, and thank you for the interesting inputs. I wanted to pick up on 2 or 3 keywords from the impulses, namely learnings and the space for innovation, and link it to the governance regulation and the tips that have come out of the project. One of which, under the third column, process, is the question whether there is a strategy review. And this, as per the original Commission proposal for Article 14 and the long-term strategies, they're basically just 10-year intervals at which member states would be submitting them. My understanding is that there's some disagreement on these timeframes in the negotiations, and also we have the 5-year cycle from the Paris Agreement. So from your respective perspectives, I would like to ask you to reflect on the usefulness and the added value of maybe more frequent updates to long-term strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have 2 questions here at the front.
Thank you, Jørgen Henningsen, Senior Advisor to the EPC. First, I have a question to the panel as a whole. Does any of you believe there is the slightest, the most remote possibility that this 1.5 degrees target is ever going to be realized? I think Kirsten was closest in addressing this question by saying that if this would be the case, or if this should be the case, EU emissions would have to go into the negative shortly after 2030. To me, that is the same as saying, for instance, we should move the Manhattan population to Mars within the next 10 years, if you take into account the political realities. And actually, I would extend the question to say, would anybody believe that if you take into account political realities, that even the 2 degrees target has any chance of being achieved? Then I have 2 specific questions to the Commission. The one is that when you see the list here from the Maximizer, you see that a number of the member states are having an emission target by 2050 at 80 to 95%, and that is what the EU has had for a long time. Now the 95% are twice as demanding as 80%. And I have had big difficulties in my home country, in Denmark, to come to grips with how to deal with this. Because if you believe in the 80%, you will have to reduce by a factor of 4 over 30 years. If you believe in 95%, you have to reduce twice by a factor of 4. That means you have to reduce the first time by 2035. These are 2 completely different worlds. How can one sensibly discuss these things without clarifying what we mean? My suggestion is that you move away from these percentages and move into tons per capita. The second question to the Commission is, you are hopefully aware that there is a big debate going out there on the CO2 neutrality of biomass. And until now, we have all fooled ourselves to believe that biomass is as valuable in a climate context as wind or solar or hydro or what have you. And now, particularly if you take into account the carbon budget way of addressing things, what does it help us? That all these trees which are now being burned down around Europe and may have recovered their carbon in 50 or 80 years' time, if we have spent our carbon budget within the next 10 years or so, or maybe 15, is that part of your thinking or approach to how to come up with a 2050 strategy?
Thank you all for your input. Nick Beglin is my name, from the Cleantech 21 Foundation in Zurich. I have a couple of questions. I thought Kirsten's inputs were excellent. I would like her to dig a little bit deeper on where she sees the uncertainties that she mentioned that we have to face. The urgency, I think, is very clear. Where are the uncertainties? And maybe also dig a level deeper on where you see, which technologies you see as those potentially bringing the radical changes that we need. And then follow on that, how you make the project choices on basically where are the links with the decarbonization projects, what drive the selection of projects that you take. And then a quick one to Paola. It sounds also very encouraging what you mentioned. If we could maybe dig a little deeper on the modernization of the energy market design, my question would be, how radical do you go there? I work heavily in innovation, and we see, particularly on that front, energy market design, things really turning on their heads, go with energy flowing no longer top down, but much more bottom up, requiring accordingly very dramatic changes in that energy market design. So the question is, how far do you go? Do you go far enough? Allowing, for example, privacy issues to be included there, network regulations to be included there, those things that matter if you start regulating and managing power bottom up and rather than top down.
Thank you. This will be our last round of questions, so I'm just giving a chance. Yes, there's one more question. Thank you.
Hi, Sunny Kunas, representing the German chemical industry. I would have a quick question for Paula Pino. And as you said, this entire process for the new roadmap has tied up a lot of human resources at the Commission, and you're also working on a very tight schedule. So my question would be, what kind of specific input are you looking for the consultation that will be published now very soon, where stakeholders then can actually really deliver an added value for the kind of information that you're looking for in the strategy? Thanks.
Thank you. As Paolo will unfortunately have to leave sharply at 11:30, I'll start the answers by giving you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry for this, but it's indeed to join the negotiations on the governance. So I heard very different questions. I'll try to tackle them all. On the intervals, indeed, we had proposed 10-year network, 10-year integrated plans with 10-year cycle for the long-term strategies. Now it should be said that there is a possibility to review these, and also in the plans we have foreseen that after 5 years that could be a midterm review, which in the proposal we said should only go upwards in terms of ambition. So in order to cater for investment certainty, notably, which is one of the objectives of the governance regulation, we should not give the signal that member states will put forward something which they will revise downwards after 5 years. But there is a possibility to review. But as you said it yourself, all of it is still being negotiated. And notably on the long-term strategies, there is still a lot being discussed, and we will see what will be the final design of the long-term strategies in terms of time horizon, in terms of content also. Which brings me also to the question on setting this very long-term objectives in terms of percentages and shares. And we do very much realize how difficult it is to come up with percentages, especially in such a long-term horizon. So what we're saying is that for the long term, it's much more important indeed to identify what are the tools that we have at hand to deliver on on decarbonization, and then identify policies or identify measures which can bring us there. Because I do understand very well where you're coming from, and indeed the difference between the 80 and 95% is immense when you look at how to translate this into practice. The CO2 neutrality of biomass in the proposal on the renewables directive, on the recast, this is something that has been very carefully also looked into in terms of foreseeing sustainability criteria for biomass and indicating what kind of biomass are we wanting to use, and especially if we're talking about an overall objective of decarbonization. So this has been reflected in the proposal, which is also being negotiated in terms of criteria, sustainability criteria, which should look into the biomass. Modernization of market design, that could lead us to a different topic and a different conference. Very shortly, it's mainly acknowledging that, as you say, there is a decentralization of the production of electricity. The reality of the electricity production changed completely, and we need to be able to also, in terms of a regulatory approach, bear this in mind. You and I can be producers of energy, of electricity today. How does this fit into the regulatory framework? Can I produce? Can I distribute? Do I need to pay tariffs in terms of distribution? So this is being tackled. The aspects of digitalization, of course, are being tackled. Demand response, the possibility to have a much more flexible system in terms of intraday, to have a much shorter term definition of prices, that also as a consumer, I can adjust my consumption to when, not necessarily now, but wait for the sun to be shining or the wind to be blowing, and have this reflected in my energy bill. So this is, in a very, very broad terms, the approach to the market design, which is also currently being negotiated. So let's see where we will land there. On the consultation, I will not prejudge on the exact terms of the consultation, because they will be available very, very soon. So for the moment, I'm not able to tell you more, but in the coming weeks, there will be a document consulting all stakeholders. So of course, you are very welcome to participate.
Thank you very much. Kirsten, there were quite a number of questions for you.
Okay, so let me start with let me go straight to the heart of the challenge around, does any of us in this room believe this is possible? That's a bloody good question. I think the short answer is, personally, probably no, but I simply can't afford to give up hope. So, you know, we're living with the fact that, and that is exactly the ambivalence. So we're living on a daily basis. We know this is big, and we still throw plastic out every day. So there's something in that condition of ambivalence that we need to work out how to design for. I also have spent, my background is 20 years of working in big business, in listed organizations. I have watched exponential change happen if you can create the conditions to shift it. And if you look back and think about where are the big moral switches, or where are the big transitions, what caused slavery to stop? There's a point in time where you see a set of practical action, legislative changes, political positions, but there's a point in which there's a moral switch, where it suddenly becomes unacceptable to think of human beings like that. We need something like that. So designing for that and thinking about, it is possible. We know that systems change in non-linear ways. We are a system. The systems we're using are systems. If we can begin to get ourselves into the mind of that, that's the hope I'm working for. Do I think it's possible? I think everything is possible. I just don't think I can afford to stop believing that in that possibility. I'm going to connect that to, though, the question of what's uncertain, because for me that is deeply connected to where is there uncertainty. For me, there's uncertainty on a lot of layers, and one of the things that I have found interesting transitioning from the world of helping large organizations deal with very volatile conditions and uncertainty in markets and businesses and industries into the world of climate change is that it's very normative. There's a lot of sense of this is what should happen, this is what needs to be, we will make this happen. And yet we are talking about planetary systems and systems of human behavior that we simply don't understand well enough to know for sure what will work, how will cause and effect dynamics engage with each other, how will we adopt. Our problem of uncertainty is fundamentally we're human beings in the mix. And the challenge we're dealing with is a quintessentially intergenerational challenge. It's a problem not of this generation, it's a problem of how the generations that come after us will accept what we are choosing for, will buy into what we say needs to happen, or will react as weather changes and the planet starts and arable land starts to shrink and we genuinely find ourselves facing the things we've been describing. We don't know how human populations are going to deal with really dramatic weather changes. We're not designing our adaptation solutions to cope with 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 100-year storms happening every year. I'm watching innovation plans that have a number of assumptions about stable weather, stable land, stable human populations, and yet we know that stability is highly unlikely. So the uncertainty for me sits in, we don't understand the geological and planetary systems we're dealing with, the thermodynamic geophysical systems we're dealing with fully. We don't understand the human systems we're dealing with. We do not fully understand the set of unintended consequences or causes effects that we're putting into play in the way in which we're trying to intervene in multiple points of leverage. We don't understand we don't, for example, understand one of the things that I deal with on a daily basis. How is money going to be made in a fully circular economy when we're in a world where it's all about making money? So we're going to need to rethink our notion of what value is, rethinking our understanding there. Those sets of uncertainties are, for me, the reason why we need strategies, not just plans. We need hypotheses and narratives that project us forward into those uncertainties, and we need to put innovation in place with a kind of properties that is looking for exponential shifts and sets of possibilities that are disruptively different. So can we design, that's why what I'm looking for is innovation that might create tipping point differences, that might lead to moral shifts, that have viral properties, that can use dynamics of system change to get us the kind of radical transformations we're going to need, that we need now. And that comes back to what choices are we making. So the technologies that I think could make exponential differences are actually the ones that a lot of the climate change world is not using yet. Artificial intelligence, 5D printing, 4D printing, genetics, nanotechnology, biotechnology, the stuff that we know we barely understand and we're afraid of, but it has a hell of a lot. They begin to change and challenge. If nothing else, they begin to give us a capacity to calculate at a scale that we've never been able to do, and make correlations and cause and effect connections at a scale we've never been able to do. So those kinds of technologies, and the technologies that are not digital, but are something to do with our capacity to think, the technology of social change and social and behavioral switches, which is going to bring me to the last point around the intervals with which we consult. Our national plans, our European plans and strategies should be consulted with, from my perspective, depending on what we want. If we think that this is about having answers and checking on regular intervals whether those answers were correct, then 5 years might work. If we think this is about engaging widespread citizenry and social inclusion and dealing with the early onsets as they come of people beginning to feel pain and hunger and hurt and be afraid, then we're going to need to think about very, very rapid iterative cycles of creativity and engagement, really deliberate co-design with the people that we need to make differences every day on what we're doing. And that, for me, I think that it's one of the multiple paradigmatic shifts. We need to change up this notion of long-term strategies about set a vision, lay in a plan, and then every so often we'll check that we were right. We are not going to be right. So this is not about being right. This is about long-term vision that gives it a narrative that can mobilize as a will to hope, to dream, to imagine, and to be willing to make choices for common good instead of self-good, and in constant iterative cycles of learning through experimentation and testing and taking risks and failing and learning again constantly.
Just a few reactions, just to build on what Kirsten just said, because I think that's a key point. The question of the interval is obviously important, but I think even more importantly, because the question is how to make that useful, this iterative process. And one of the questions that we need to tackle now is how can we increase the usefulness of these strategies? Because the point is not to build strategies and then to monitor or whatever, it's just to make them useful. And many things have to do with how do we do them? What do we report? Because again, we are not talking about reporting just to be able to track and to check. We are not anymore in a blame and shame process. This is a new world we are living in since Paris, right? This is a new world where the learning process is essential, and the type of information that people need for themselves in order to be able to learn, to be able to deliver something more useful or better or improve next time is very different from the old world where we had to report information that could be checked by someone outside. So that, I think that's a very different point. And the question of the interval then, to some extent, it follows from that. If we are able to clarify what we want to do with the strategies and how they can be useful, then the question of the interval becomes very different. Very quickly on the point on the objective, to some extent, this question of the percentage, etc., it's solved by the Paris Agreement. We need to go to global net zero, and global net zero, it means that more or less everyone has to go to net zero. The only question is that there will be some countries may need a bit more time, some others can go a bit faster, but this depends a lot on the situations. But anyway, all countries need to start by the objective to go at some point to net zero, and this has some very concrete consequences on what needs to be done today, given the situation in which a given country is, to go to net zero. And whether it is, to be honest, 2040 or 2050, there are some concrete decisions that need to be taken anyway whatever the context, if you want to open the window of opportunity to do that. And finally, on the question whether we believe 1.5 is feasible or possible, or to be honest, I'm not sure that it's the best question, because yes, everything is possible. I mean, theoretically, the question is, how do we make it happen? And here we are pointing to a big gap, which has already been pointed very clearly, but want to stress again that there is still a big disconnect between what this target means and what are the type of transformation that need to happen. And this is something that people are not aware on what are the conditions that need to be fulfilled if we want to have any hope of going close to 1.5 or even 2C. And as soon as we are not able to be extremely clear, crystal clear about what this means for tomorrow, then this discussion about whether it's feasible or not will remain theoretical and not be linked to concrete decision making.
Thank you. Yeah, being aware that I need to be short, very interesting discussion. I would think I want to come back to 2 points. So one is also about the target and our basically the temperature goal of 1.5. And I think part of the debate we are facing in the next weeks, and we at least want to win, is to stay with the hope. And I think to get to action rather than being depressed by the reality of real economy process where there's looking at carbon budgets. And I think that's part of what we need to do with the mid-century strategy. There is still a proof and a discussion to happen of what should EU's target be. And net zero by 2050 seems, based on what you've just the number you shared, seem to be too late. So I think looking at the science and numbers, assessing the uncertainty and the range, and basically staying with taking the conclusions from a hard reality of where we are in terms of climate change, but getting into, we have a lot of skills, we have a lot of technologies already, and making use of them is the first message we think needs to be out, and a no regret option in terms of looking at the clean energy package. We think there is a lot of scope to go beyond, to deliver and to reduce emissions very rapidly with the technologies we have. We are talking about 27%, 30%, 32%. And we know the political will is the problem, but in terms of technology, there is much more rapid possible. And I think that's something we shouldn't forget if we talk about the long-term targets as well, that there are many short-term options which we haven't used sufficiently. On biomass, I think that's a very interesting and important point, and we do not share the assessment of the Commission that the current proposal is watertight and helpful in terms of in climate terms. It includes sustainability criteria, but it doesn't rule out stumps and it doesn't rule out the use of whole trees, and therefore is likely to increase our emissions. We know for a long time that we have to stay away from using this stuff because it takes us decades to get the carbon back. So that's a fundamental flaw in the proposal which moves, which goes forward. Going back to the project results, I think learning the key point. The hard part for this project was what was in our project objectives, to create learning between member states and institutions. And we've seen that it's very hard to get out to officials and to create a sense of, to create a platform of learning. I think we moved quite far, and we had good success with this project to be out, to get the topic out, to get discussions rolling, and I'm so grateful for all representatives of governments being here. But I think there is more needed, and we just got a sense from you, Kirsten, of what is needed and how open the atmosphere needs to be to put us all in a position of learning, and this is just a different way, and I'm happy that this project, that we were able to get this message out today, and hopefully, and looking forward to hear how governments feel about that in the next session.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for the most interesting start of the day. I hope that in the course of the next sessions we'll be able to come back to some of the solutions. I think that what you put forward was very interesting and really made us to think outside the box. So hopefully we'll be able to return to these as well as on the different policy tools, etc. I'm sure that these will be flagged out in the course of the discussion. But for the sake of time, let's move on to our next discussion. For the next session, I'll hand over the microphone to my colleague, Marco.